All right. I think that's enough time. Uh, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's webinar. It's called Vinegar Syndrome, A Race to Preserve the Taboo. We have our guest speakers from Vinegar Syndrome. But before that, my name is Herbert Duran. I'm part of the programming committee here at the Archivist Roundtable of New York. I'm also the assistant archivist at Centro, Center for Puerto Rican Studies at CUNY Hunter. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to mention some upcoming art events. We have Thursday, October 5th at 6:15, a private tour at Columbia University's Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library that's available to art members only, and the registration link, I think we're going to put in the chat box, but also available on the art website. And then mark your calendars because it's New York Archives Week from October 11th to October 18th. Archivists and institutions throughout the city are invited to share virtual and in-person events, collection tours, and community conversations on the Art Archives Week calendar via submission form. The deadline for that is Friday, October 6th, and see link in chat for details. And yeah, without further ado, let's get down to business. Vinegar Syndrome is a film restoration and distribution company with a catalog of hundreds of feature films produced primarily between the 1960s and the 1990s. Their namesake is a constant reminder of what they're fighting against. Simply put, the term vinegar syndrome describes a chemical reaction that deteriorates motion picture film over time. And film preservation is a race against time, especially with long neglected genres and underground films. We have two people from Vinegar Syndrome. We have Oscar, 2020 graduate of School of Film Preservation, and in parentheses, hopefully a 2023 graduate of NYU's Tisch Moving Image Archiving and Preservation Program. He currently holds the position of archivist and vault manager for Vinegar Syndrome. And then we have Lindsay Miller. They're a media archivist and writer. They currently work as the digital asset manager at Vinegar Syndrome and the personal archivist for video artist Davidson Gigliotti. Lindsay holds a BA in mass communications from UNC Asheville and an MA in moving image archiving and preservation from NYU. Their master thesis, Fucking with the Canon, explores archiving porn in the digital age. And just some final housekeeping items. Please note that this event is being recorded, so if you wish to turn off your cameras, please do so now. And we ask that everyone silence their microphones for the duration of tonight's talk. Please include any questions or comments in the chat box. We'll have time at the end to answer them. And you'll also find a link to view Vinegar Syndrome's website in the chat box, in addition to other art-related items. I'm gonna be quiet now and let Vinegar Syndrome start. Thank you, guys.
Cool. Thank you for that intro. Very, very nice. Hello. It is good for all of you to be here. I really appreciate it. And I know Oscar does too. So let me share my screen and hopefully it'll work this time. Okay.
I can start. Yeah. So
Yeah, go ahead.
thank you to the Archivist Roundtable of New York for having us today. I'm really excited to actually speak about this because both of us spend all our days thinking about this and never getting to share or talk with anybody about the work that we're doing. And I think if you went back 30 years, it would be really difficult to have a conversation about why preserving and actually conserving some of these materials are really important. I'm Oscar. I'm the archivist and vault manager. I've been doing this since 2021. I love my job. I think it's really cool. There are really great parts and really not so great parts, but like all the handling of film materials are my favorite. part of it. But yeah, so I think one of the main reasons why I was personally interested in doing this presentation as well was because I think there are a lot of well, our catalog has a good portion of adult titles. I think it's very unique in the distribution world to actually try to preserve these films instead of just exploiting them and like leaving them on the cutting room floor. So I think that's kind of my basic introduction before going more into depth in the next slide and Lindsay's introductions.
Yeah, like Oscar said, I work here. I am the digital asset manager. I've been working here for about a year now. It's coming up on my 1-year anniversary, which is exciting. I love the work that I do. I talk about it a lot with people, and I'm always interested in sharing more. So I'm just very grateful to be here. So yeah, let's go.
Yeah, so starting off, I think it's important to kind of answer the question, what is Vinegar Syndrome? I think we're all archivists, so we kind of know a little bit about what Vinegar Syndrome is, but not the company exactly. I think as it was said by Herbert, basically it's an acidic smell that's given off by decaying film because of the triacetate base. So essentially the entire formation of this company was meant to focus on those films which were going to be particularly in danger of being lost to this type of deterioration. There are many reasons why we actually focus on this specific type of film. Genre films are particularly neglected in the history of cinema, just because they're a little bit more difficult. There are some interesting case studies, especially with rights. And again, they're not the best of the best. I think sometimes you get really cool movies and very unique movies, which stand above the rest, but for the vast majority of them, you're going to pick out interesting bits and almost documentary facets of them, which kind of catch your eye with a second look. And the history behind it is really fascinating. So from the very beginning, there was this focus on films which were underseen and kind of forgotten. So you have the lost films of Herschel Gordon Lewis, a very famous horror director. There was a long-standing myth that he had directed porn films, and eventually these films, while not exactly porn, they were very erotic in nature, and they came out in 2012, were rediscovered. And this was mostly by chance due to the fact that the company that we work for is kind of obsessed with trying to find new materials and new elements. Film is if you've ever handled film, it's a fascinating actual medium because there are just so many components of it. It's constantly changing throughout the decades. And especially in the 1960s through the 1980s, so much happened that, you can't even research this stuff these days. But currently, we've been building out the actual film archive there, which has been a process since the very beginning. There's always been a film archive, and I use archive in quotes because of the fact that at the very beginning, and I'm going to go into this a little bit later, there was cold storage, but we're figuring this out as an actual company. This was before I got there too. So essentially, over the years, there's been a buildup of actually trying to use more professional methods, like using actual archival materials and archival processes to actually make sure that these films are taken care of and survive a little bit better. I think that's kind of why it's really interesting to have this company as a name actually continue to kind of fight for these movies. If the name of the company was Vinegar Syndrome and all of our films were vinegared in 10 years after having released them, I think there would be a really big problem. But I think the title of our presentation is also about the taboo as well, because I've gotten so many questions over the course of the last 2 years while I've been working here about whether or not these films will continue to be, these types of films are going to continue to be released. So the good news is in 2021 or so, we acquired a new collection and a new coworker His name is Steven, which is why I said Dystropix there. Dystropix is one of the like enormous sexploitation and hardcore motion picture distributors and production companies. Actually, it's kind of like a sad moment because just last week, Arthur Morowitz passed away, an enormous figure in home media and in hardcore feature distribution. So I don't really do dedications, but if this is dedicated to anybody, it's to him. He saved more film than anybody's ever given him credit for. So I think, hardcore features and trying to preserve and release these features is first and foremost about making sure those materials are safe and kept longer and longer. We did have an argument one time about whether or not vinegar could be cured, which I just let him win that argument, but nonetheless. Next slide.
Do you want to do this one since you've
I can do this
been
one. I
around
can
for
do
a
this
little
one.
longer? Yeah.
Yeah, so basically at the very beginning, the actual collection was doing a very good job of trying to collect film from different places. At the very beginning, there was a storage issue where a lot of these labs and film libraries didn't actually have the space or the wherewithal to actually continue to store these films indefinitely. So eventually a lot of these film collections ended up in Bridgeport. And I think that's really interesting because of the fact that these aren't exhibition prints, these aren't release prints, these are actual preprint materials. So in order to have those materials be utilized to the fullest extent, you have to kind of build up an entire robust system, which at that point was very like bare bones. And since then, there's been a crazy amount of work on the front end for actually getting people better quality releases, which is a bit out of both of our areas. They do a really great job in restoration. They're like truly the best in the business. But oftentimes with like the sake with for-profit companies, there ends up being a backlog with things which are finished. So essentially there was a build up in materials and a slowdown in actual processing of these types of things. It was just so much work that eventually in 2019, they hired Selznick graduate Justin Liberty, who did a lot of really great work building out the database and making sure rights and elements were organized, and did a lot of advocacy for these types of films as well. I think everybody remembers probably, if you're interested in this topic, the famous Letterboxd hardcore project. But since then, in 2021, when I started, there was an enormous amount of backlog still, crazy amount. It's a Sisyphean task where the moment you have another film done, put in the can, more comes in. I think there was one point when I was working where we'd be taking in about one pallet of film a week, and this is in addition to all the other things which were on our backlog. And these are all preprint materials. Not all of it can be canned. But again, we're very careful with how we actually deal with materials which we're not going to end up putting into the film archive. And our film archive, in addition to that, throughout this entire process, throughout all the iterations of our HVAC system, it was cold and we continued to get colder. I think this is like a very key facet of this, where like many archival institutions, I know many of you are across the country dealing with your own situations too. We're dealing with an old building where we're on the second floor of this building, which is good because we're safe from floods. We're in a flood zone as well, and we're below the third floor. So we're a little bit more safe from the actual possibility of rainwater possibly coming through the roof, which can always be an issue. But in addition to that, we also make sure to collaborate with a bunch of different types of archives, nonprofit archives where we gift materials, donate materials, and obviously as a for-profit institution still, we can't accept gifts. So we're just kind of we're kind of operating as like, this is part of our business. it's Vinegar Syndrome. Our job is to prevent Vinegar Syndrome for our films. So we're just continuing doing that. And both Lindsay and I, over the past time that we've been working there, have seen a crazy amount of change. And I think today we're going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing and why we think it's important, some of the problems. And this is just a very basic prelude to it. And also we're going to explain some very basic film stuff because I love to do that in a very simple way.
Good segue.
Okay.
There you go.
Yes. So here's things that everybody here knows. So I'm going to click this away really quickly. So everybody always asks why it's called Vinegar Syndrome, triacetate film. So I like to use that as a method of actually explaining our actual programming. We're very elements first. So a good portion, the vast majority of films in our collection, like if you take apart or if you don't count or discount some polyester prints which are made of new films, they're almost all triacetate. There's some diacetate, but it's very few and far between. That being said, we were very, very cautious with the actual vinegared films, obviously just because of the off-gassing. But surprisingly speaking, we have very little vinegar just because of the fact we do like put an enormous amount of effort and time into making sure these materials are kept very, very, very close to the best possible conditions. Best possible conditions, even though it's the very, very low temperature. I wish we could get to that, but I'm hoping in the next 10 years we can, but the amount of cost and overhead is just kind of daunting. So we're doing the best we can.
Next. Yeah.
When we do get vinegar, however, we have like a crazy amount of weird situations that come about. On the far left, you have an example of extreme mold, mildew, and obviously vinegar, which came from a film distributor out of the South. Can't say more. The second to the left is a Cinerama film, the real B of a Cinerama film, which was just completely toast. If you know anything about Cinerama, you know what real B is. It's like there's A, B, and then C. It's completely shot and terrible. But the one on the closest to the one to the right was an actual one of the film collections that we rescued was from a greenhouse. It was stored in a greenhouse for over 30 years in France. And that has been an enormous issue in terms of trying to deal with something which is apparently literally could be considered vinegar at this point. You could pour it over your salad. And then obviously there's some mildew and actual hardening of the actual films there on the left. But we see a lot of it over the past year. We've been building out an offsite storage facility where we'll actually be able to lower the temperature, actually vent out all of this off-gassing. And that took a very, very long amount of time, mostly because of the fact that space is a really hot commodity. We're not just sharing space with film, we're sharing it with Blu-rays and products. And that's an enormous issue where we just continuously, the moment we kind of expand the collection, we have to compress it back again. And I don't mean physically compress it. I mean like making sure that it's actually taking up the least amount of space in the most efficient way possible. So yeah, so here's some of the worst ones. This is not exactly an adult film, but this is a lot of these films come to us in various states too, where a good portion of preprint materials for these adult films do come from, I don't know, collections which are not exactly taking care of these materials as best as they possibly could. This particular one had a crazy amount of rust on the outside and had been dealing with sitting in rainwater for a while. but we've come across this with a few sex film titles. I think the main reason for this type of situation continuously happening more and more is that these types of films are seen as products. They're literally things to sell to theaters and eventually to home distributors. So once these films are done, they toss them, or if they don't toss them, they throw them in an unclimate controlled storage locker, which is the case with this one. But if you see on the far right, that's kind of what it looks like when I attempted to scan it. A very cool scene with an alien and a flamethrower. The flamethrower alien hands. Yeah.
Wait,
Next
really?
slide. Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
I
Very
can't
cool
tell if you're
movie.
can't tell if
No,
you're
no, this is
joking.
totally true. But I keep this up because I think it's really important to know that these are just basic film links. If you put head to tail trailer for a film, you get the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza, and Eiffel Tower around 1,000 feet. So it's around this size, and then 2,000 feet is around the CN Tower in Toronto, which I believe was at one point like at least the tallest tower in North America. At least, sorry, bad architecture fun facts for me that I don't really know anything about. But it just gives you a sense of like what the amount of space that these actual films actually take up. A Blu-ray is very small and can take up a very compact amount of space in your bookshelf. But these Blu-rays, like in terms of actual quality, still as good as they can possibly be. They don't measure up to the actual film itself. So we want to make sure that that stays alive just in case.
Cool. So this is a question that we both get a lot. Why preserve porn at all? And that's a very, very good question, right? It is a commercial product at the end of the day. That's why people are creating it, to make money. And because of that, porn has really been seen as lowbrow for a long time. And so that's why archives, we'll talk about this a little bit more too. Pornography can be found in a lot of archives, but not a whole lot is done with it. But at some point in time, advertisements, educational films, and industrial films were also seen as lowbrow. And archives didn't really collect them because they didn't see the value. But then years later, they kind of realized, well, wait a second, we can tell a lot of different things from these. We can see advertising trends, we can see what products were failing at a time, what things people were interested in. And I think the same can be said with moving image pornography. So yeah, it can tell us things about, sexual trends and behaviors, sure. But what a lot of people forget is that moving image pornography can also be records of people at work. Sex work is one of the oldest professions ever, and it's a profession that continues to exist despite constant attempts to censor it and to stop it. And so this is another reason why, especially with these older stag films, why they should be preserved and why more effort should be put into them so that the legacy of these people that create them and just of these films in general can be remembered. Plus, the people who create pornography are really, really, really unique. For example, I had some free time back in July, and I was digging around some of the sex films that we had, and I came across a print of a film called Sweet Dreams by Honey Lee Cottrell. And this was a short film that was created in 1979 by Honey Lee. It was commissioned by the National Sex Forum in San Francisco. And this was a very, very exciting find for me personally because Honey Lee was one of the founders of On Our Backs, which was the first lesbian erotica magazine to ever be published in the United States. I had done some previous research about On Our Backs and about Honey Lee. Her archive is actually all at Cornell right now, and it's amazing. So I instantly recognized this name, and I let out a little gasp because I hadn't seen this before. And to my knowledge, I have not found another print of this film. Cornell might have one. I'm getting some conflicting answers. So yeah, this was a really cool find for me. I got to talk to Susie Bright, who was Honey's partner at some point in time and during her life. And we just kind of discussed, what it was like back then, creating these things about Honey's legacy. And so, yeah. So, like I was saying, do other archives preserve porn? Yes and no. You probably work at an archive, or maybe you work at an archive that has some type of pornography, and that doesn't have to be moving images, right? Photos can be considered pornographic, written works can be considered pornographic, as well as paintings, things like that. But not every archive has the means to make these materials fully accessible. And sometimes they just can't be made accessible at all. And that's for a lot of different varying reasons. Um, and a lot of times researchers who are interested in working with these materials, they have to jump through a lot of hoops to get access to them. I think the best kind of example that I can think of is the Kinsey Institute at the University of Indiana. They have a very, very large human sexuality collection, a lot of stag films, and they, to my knowledge, require researchers to submit some type of research proposal before they can access any of the materials. So they want to know, who are you working with? What exactly do you want to look at? When will you be here? It's not kind of like, oh, just go into the special collections and let me just pull out, the porno to watch. It's much more guarded. So here are some basic terms when it comes to archiving sex films. Joe Rubin, our boss, proofread this screen before showing it to you all, so I can attest that it is accurate. But yeah, there are a lot of different types of pornographic films, and there are a lot of different ways you can define pornography. Sometimes, someone's own personal perception of what pornography is or what they consider to be obscene, that can influence what they think it is. So yeah, these are just some really basic ones. Trying to think of point out important ones. Stag film, if you aren't familiar with stag films, they are anonymously made short films that were they took place, or they were filmed kind of in the early 20th century. And these displayed hardcore acts, and they were normally played in front of large groups of men at brothels. Other kinds of things, we have, hard versions versus soft versions. Hard being hardcore, so you're actually seeing penetration, things on screen, whereas softcore, that's more of the simulated kind of sex, the artsy fartsy erotica kind of stuff that you can kind of get away with wide releases.
Yeah, and I also think it's really important to focus a lot of this to continue on, where in addition to kind of knowing some of the labels that we actually find on cans, like what Lindsay was just going over, like kit, hot, cool, there's a crazy amount of information in the actual generational film elements. Whenever we find something, regardless of whether or not it's a sex film or not, we're always hoping to find the original camera negative or some kind of original material. And essentially, whether or not it's negative or reversal, we'll find a lot of A/B roll, a lot of reversal for exploitation films. But essentially, we're always trying to get to that first generation. And I think that's particularly because of the fact that these, like we were talking about earlier, it's very rare to come across materials in general, which are of the originating actual in the camera shot film material. But so like oftentimes people ask me, do you only have porn? And the answer to that question is no, not only porn at all. We have a crazy amount of film of all varieties, shapes, and sizes. But feature-length pornographic material happens to be one of the ones which was plucked the least and the most rarely from these film libraries. So in a very strange way, we kind of, this archive ended up kind of getting a lot of the stepchildren, I guess. I don't want to use that term rather, but the actual pushed away elements. I don't want to use the B, but so I don't know. We tried to go for that original material, but then there are also some other generations, which are also particularly interesting. Four, I think this was another one where our boss again went through and took an axe to everything that we had written and held dear, and basically like said non-preservation. That's why I added it in quotes. I think release prints are really important because I think film exhibition is a practice that needs to continue on in order for film to live on. But that being said, for restoration materials and for the actual home media market, it's much more difficult to take scratches, remove fade from extreme cases of we really used release print than it is for actually going back to an actual, I don't know, even a third generation negative element. But yeah, I think this is like another important example of like we focus on materials first, and that kind of ends up kind of allowing a lot of these films to kind of come to us, especially because of the fact that we'll actually not just conserve them and put them in the right temperatures, but we may possibly release them. And we don't release everything. Once we actually find out what something is, we'll go through an enormous lengthy process of like trying to figure out whether or not we can find the rights, and this is also out of our area, but we also keep in the database like very fastidious notes regarding copyright. And that's just because of the fact that these films are easy to release in certain ways, but very difficult in others. And we need to be very sensitive with some of these kinds of films too. Next slide. Yeah, so I also wanted to keep going on like, sorry to bore you on and on about like drone on and on about conservation, preservation, but I kind of follow, and I think Lindsay and Joe and everybody who kind of works in the film archive, including Stephen, we all kind of sometimes wrestle with different types of definitions, mainly because of the fact that the actual film archive itself doesn't function exactly like an actual nonprofit archive. So when we actually put resources, as in cans and space in the actual film archive, we kind of want to know what we're talking about. Definitions are really important, especially because we continuously get asked by strangers, shouldn't that not be preserved? So to go in more into depth with that, we have some basic definitions that we kind of like, I kind of go with. The first three, I believe, first, film restoration, film preservation, film conservation are definitions from FIAF. What we do is not analog preservation, unfortunately. We do primarily digital preservation, and we make high resolution master files, which Lindsay will go into a little bit more depth later. But the film conservation, at least in the archive, is about making sure these materials are kept as close, the materials close to the original are kept in cold, dry, like very organized and in our database so that they can't get lost in the future, while film preservation is making a copy of that to ensure that the actual original elements are safe. And again, we can make access files and other versions of the film. Sometimes we even make prints so that these can actually be released without damage to the original. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about active film storage, because I think there's I think one of the things that I came into this not knowing much about, but every film collector has a crazy amount of film, and pulling from that collection is a good thing. If you actually are able to use your collection and provide access to it, I do think this is a very good thing. Especially if you actually put in the resources and time into making sure it's put in cold and dry conditions. And then passive is kind of another thing which I've come across only by only by looking at collections that I've seen over the years, where it's basically just keeping film just because it's something to hold on to. I don't think that this is like, I think everybody here can probably agree that if you're holding on to priceless film materials, whether or not you think they're priceless or not, and not doing anything with them without providing access or some form of actual long-term preservation, like climate and climate control, it's kind of a disservice to history and the future. And throwing away as opposed to deaccessioning. This was another thing which caused many debates at the beginning, because I wanted to make sure that we knew what was being tossed, when it was being tossed. So this is something both Lindsay and I have definitely made an enormous amount of effort into trying to ensure that we don't lose history and we don't just disregard something because it's a lesser generational element or has less preservation value or anything of the sort. Yeah, next slide.
Yeah.
So here's a little bit of a chronology. 2021. This is what I walked into on my first day. It looks good. Don't look at the titles. Just kidding. You can't see titles, but they've all been released by now. But this is kind of what it was, all very, very cold. It hadn't been really used for a while, but you can kind of see what we're walking into. There are a bunch of boxes, lots of loose reels on boxes, and someone was even keeping a printing press in the actual film archive and a drum. The problem with this is that it's just like, at a certain point, it became active film storage, which people were obviously using this and keeping the room cool and making sure it was cared for. But like the actual, you can see some in the bottom right there. The process of actually going through these films and making sure that they are what they say they are is very, very slow and takes one person to actually go through everything and make sure that everything is actually there. Everybody would say, this is there, I think. This is where I think it should be. It's on that shelf. And fast forward to today. This is what I took today of the same thing, which feels nice. So again, we work very closely with Tuscan. They're very good to us, and we love inert plastics, especially polypropylene. And I also like the vents and everything like this. But this has been an enormous amount of work. And even currently, we're going back over our earlier work to make sure that any mistakes that we found to be mistakes were actually corrected. So this is an enormous amount of work. And I don't know, if you ask how many of them are adult films, I cannot tell you, but it's a lot. I also blurred out some titles on the far left over there, but yeah, going forward. Yeah, sorry I keep going on, but I think, yeah, I wanted to kind of talk about like the amount of space film takes up again. I'll just go over this really quickly, but I've been thinking about this a lot, which is real estate. An entire palette worth of actual Blu-rays and DVDs that takes up around the same amount of space as maybe 10 films with their actual picture elements and sound elements all stacked on top of each other like a terrible mess. So if you have all of that Blu-ray material and versus film, eventually there becomes this weird mentality where you don't know whether or not this is actually taking up space correctly, which is why we really try to make sure everything is cared for properly. But in addition to that, there are an enormous amount of copyright and access issues. As we said before, we don't release everything. We try to conserve a lot. And it's basically the two people who work in this archive are Lindsay and I, and we have help every once in a while from, always give credit to Stephen Morowitz, who has his own collection, Distropix, and also Joe does help out sometimes when he's not in a mood. And and essentially, this is kind of like a two-person operation, like many archives. It's tough to find funding sometimes, but again, this is like, as we'll talk about later on, it's like a labor of love in some strange way. But yeah, moving on.
Very true. Cool. So let me tell you a little bit more about the Vinegar Syndrome archive. So in addition to being the digital asset manager, I am also the database manager. So I am kind of keeping track of all the film reels, all the different elements and things like that, and working with Oscar to make sure everything is in the right place and whatnot. So processing and cataloging kind of really began in 2019, 2020 with Justin, the previous archivist, and the archive has made really steady progress since then. As of September 1st, we have over 24,000 reels of film in the archive, which makes up to be around 7,000 elements. And then we have around 4,000 unique titles in our database. And when I say unique titles, I literally mean 4,000 different movies. And that includes, feature films, short films, there's porn in there, there's educational films, there's industrial films. We have like music videos and things, a lot of trailers. Yeah, we have a ton of stuff. I'd say I don't have an exact statistic for how many films are sex and exploitation films, and that's just because not everything has been cataloged. I want to say right now it's around 30%, but if we were to fully catalog absolutely everything that we have in our archive right now, it'd probably be around 50%. At least that seems to be accurate. And then here's a little graph that breaks down kind of the elements further and how we kind of track them. The majority of things in the archive are moving images, and those are things with and without soundtracks, followed by the sound elements, and then trailers. We have a lot of trailers. Additionally, we also do have magnetic tape and things like that in the archive, but because that is not really our focus, we're not really cataloging things like that. We're kind of creating inventories for kind of if we do need to come back to those materials for some reason. The workflow, I can do this one. So this is a very kind of rough workflow. Every single day is different, and every single film requires a different kind of treatment. And yeah, so first, materials will be delivered to Bridgeport. After that, these elements are going to be briefly inspected and rehoused. We kind of determine just kind of general condition, what's the film gauge, what kind of element is this, does it have vinegar, things like that. We put it into our blue Tuscan cans, which we love so much. Thank you, Tuscan. And if anything is in an advanced state of decay, that is separated and dealt with on its own. From there, we put the elements into the database. It's given an accession number and a printed label. And then films we release are typically scanned on site. Sometimes they go off site. It just kind of depends, like I said. So yeah, any of those conserved elements, the ones that we have actually gone through, make sure we know what exactly it is, those are the ones that are being pulled for the restorations. And then after the films have been scanned, they undergo the restoration process. So these are things like the dust busting, the color correction, creating subtitles. At this point in time, we create special features and things like that. And then once everything has been completed, I become the digital asset manager, basically. And I preserve all of that onto the LTOs. And if you are not familiar with LTOs, LTO stands for linear tape open. It is a tape-based storage format that can preserve up to, how big are ours? I think 10 terabytes are the ones that I'm using right now. They're LTO8s, which is a lot of data, a lot. And I create 2 LTOs, one that stays on site and then one that will go off site. Very important to have off-site storage. As Oscar mentioned, we're in a flood zone. Climate change, all that kind of stuff. Gotta be careful. Yeah, we're kind of, what I'm doing right now, I'm the first kind of digital asset manager to kind of work here. Previously, all the archiving of the digital assets was done by one of the restoration artists. So when I kind of joined, I had a really big backlog of films to go through and just all these hard drives, so many hard drives. It was really, really overwhelming. So I've been going through those very, very steadily and just trying to create a workflow that is simple, that can still be used by the restoration artists. You know, if I'm not there one day and they want to quickly get something from the LTO, I'm not trying to, you know, go crazy with, oh, you need to check fixity and the checksums and blah, 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 blah. No, they need the information. This is how they can get it. Yeah. And then cataloging. I am also doing a lot of cataloging because I run the database. We use FileMaker, and we have this nice little custom FileMaker that is wonderful. I've come to really, really enjoy using FileMaker, which sounds so nerdy to say. And I hate that I've become that person who just loves spreadsheets and things like that, but here I am. So once an element has been inspected and rehoused, we add it to the database. We track several things in the database. One are the films in the archive. So this would be the individual titles that I was talking about and all of that associated metadata. So that would be things like the cast of the film, the plot description, who produced the film, the director, things like that. Next, we keep track of the elements in the archive and that associated metadata. So that would be things like the accession number, the condition of the film, or of the element, I should say, its location or its shelf location in the archive, stuff like that. And then Oscar briefly mentioned this, we also keep track of licensing and copyright information. So these are things like, I keep contracts here, you know, payment information, if that needs to be dealt with, correspondence between the licensor and us, or sometimes the directors and us. We find so many different things when we're going through the film cans. So this has been just like, it's been a really, really fun challenge to just kind of fill out this database to the fullest extent. So cataloging continued. We've got our not safe for work section finally. So there's a really common misconception, I think, that everyone at Vinegar Syndrome sits around and watches porn all day. Not quite. I certainly wish that were the case, but it's not. But we do work with it a lot. And working with porn can be kind of a sticky situation, especially when you're cataloging things, and that's for a couple of different reasons. One, there are films in the archive that I have never seen, and I may never see these because of the element's current condition. This is mostly the older stuff. We do have lost films, right? We have the stag films, like I was talking about. We have loops. So we can't always, there isn't always a way for us to just put it on the scanner and watch it. I can always go and inspect a film to see if I can find out more information about it, but we can't always rely on the metadata of pornography for finding out more information, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, if you go to end credits, sometimes in pornography there is no end credits. There's no credits at all. You have no idea who made it. You have no idea the year it was released. Nothing. Another reason why it's hard is that stag films were never really registered for copyright. You know, they were illicit material. You would literally get arrested if you were found in possession of them. So why would anyone go about trying to copyright them? Additionally, performers and creators in these films, they would use fake names and they would change their appearance so that way they could avoid being recognized. And this is a practice that is still used by sex workers today. And that's something that I think should really be respected. Especially, you know, with the newer stuff, but with the older stuff, again, it can kind of get sticky. You can try your best to kind of piece together who a certain person might be based off of, oh, this person looks familiar. I remember seeing his face, you know, in this film, but you can't always find stuff. Other factors that kind of go into cataloging that I'm constantly thinking about. One of my ongoing goals has been using more inclusive and kind of politically correct language while I'm cataloging. One example, I guess the most prominent example, is the use of the word prostitute and prostitution versus sex work and sex worker. Prostitute and prostitution, they have negative connotations attached to them. But those were the words that were being used when these films were made, right? So they are accurate to a certain extent. Whereas sex work and sex worker have become the preferred terms that are used by the community today. So kind of to deal with this and kind of come up with a solution, what you will often see in our catalog or even just on the Vinegar Syndrome site, you'll still see the word prostitute and prostitution used when it comes to describing the plot of that film. However, internally, we have made that change to include things to tag those films as, oh, this film is about sex work instead of just prostitution. Yeah, just to kind of keep reminding ourselves that language changes, people co-opt phrases all of the time. And like I said earlier, it's really important to remember the sex workers that participated in these films and that were creating them, and to just keep them in mind throughout the entire process of cataloging all of it. Otherwise, we don't really censor ourselves in the database. So, you know, some subjects that I have tagged recently include gangbang, orgies, virginities, fetish, bestiality, necrophilia. Like, we've got it all. We've really got it all. There's nothing original under the sun anymore. We do try to work to provide context as to why a film or a subject would be seen as controversial or problematic today. One example that I've been kind of working on recently just has to do with the genres itself. So there's a subgenre within exploitation and kind of sexploitation films, which is the rape and revenge film. These were kind of popularized in the 70s with I Spit on Your Grave. That's not a Vinegar Syndrome title. We're not releasing that. That's just an example. And Thriller, A Cruel Picture, that is a Vinegar Syndrome title, though, that you can look and purchase, by the way. Yeah, that is just something that I am very passionate and think, what am I trying to say here? Sorry, let me back up a second. If a film has a major plot point in which it is rape, I am tagging it. That is the subject of the film. I see a lot of plot summaries sometimes that really try to beat around the bush and kind of skirt around these problematic things, but I think it's important to just call it what it is. So that extends to things like sex trafficking, misogyny, racism, things like that. I'm really trying to be accurate with that and just call it like it is. But again, this is sticky because there are people out there who get off on being degraded. This is true. There are people who have kinks, who like being called names, who like offensive language, BDSM culture, things like that. Like I said, words and phrases are being co-opted all of the time. It's just really important to be mindful of the language you use, kind of constantly question what you're using. Is this the right word to use? I'm not sure. I am always going over to the Library of Congress's website to look at their subject headings for things, because I just always kind of run into these walls where it's like, is that the right word to use? Not sure. And finally, again, not everything will ever be cataloged. And that's just because we just don't know enough. There are some of these films that they were made and they were quite literally, they weren't meant to be preserved, right? The people who created them, they don't know that, like, they had no idea that it would end up here today. So sometimes you just have lost films and you just kind of have to deal with the information that you have. Future issues.
Yeah, before that was perfectly put. Another like going off of what Lindsay was talking about too, these are a particular another enormous example, which is a subgenre of adult films, which we don't really know what to do, which kind of fits into that category of things that may just end up being lost, are these loops, which are from the actual storefronts of these apotheca. I don't know what the name, but it's a pharmacy, like the but basically these were loop films, very short form films, and a lot of these, there's, they're very intimate, very they all have fake names and everything like that. So you can't really find much information about them. They don't fit into like a release schedule, even if we were a nonprofit which was interested in talking about, I don't know, like different sexual habits over the course of history. These kind of occupy a very strange space. And for now, our best case scenario for just keeping them is keeping them in cold storage in the current boxes that they're in. And there's some like beautiful actual object material based facet to some of these. There are even 3D ones, which are really fascinating. Ones where people are playing guitar and playing music, and so these are very special, like very small independent things that there's always going to be issues and things that fall through the cracks. But I think in the future, unfortunately, these may be not exactly something which like we're going to preserve, like Lindsay says, in that we're going to actually make digital files, or we'll have to deal with it as time comes. But yeah, that's kind of my piece about it, where that's one of the collections which we don't really know much to do about. It's not even a short film, it's not a feature film. So where does it fit in? Yeah, next slide.
So this is kind of where we wrap up. And we wanted this to be fun. So we thought we would recommend some Vinegar Syndrome titles. These are all adult titles. If you are interested in dipping your toe into the water, it's very, very fun, I will say. I don't know. Do you want to go first? You go first, Oscar.
I mean, we both have Labor of Love. That one you just have to watch it. You can only see it to believe it. Evil Come, Evil Go is like a Night of the Hunter kind of movie. It like plays off of that. Stiff Competition, very, very like well written, strange movie about cunnilingus. Um, uh, Prisoner of Paradise is a very crazy movie about Nazis on an island. It's just so surreal that you can't believe anything that you're seeing. And it has a good soundtrack. And Dracula Sucks is just like the actual hard version, and the soft version are both equally interesting in their own ways. And in addition to that, there is also a soundtrack that we found that we never had a place for on the disc. So that's kind of like a weird piece of lost movie trivia. So I always think about that whenever I think of Dracula Sucks, where it's a very cool soundtrack that I wish we had some way of actually putting out there. But yeah, that's my little list.
Nice. So mine, number one, A Labor of Love. Like Oscar said, you just got to see it. It's really, really, really good. This was when I first met Oscar. He gave me this movie and was like, "You need to watch it." And let me just tell you, life changing. Number two, Sex World. This is like a parody of Westworld, kind of, where they go to like a resort and then they're like, "Oh, what's your biggest sexual fantasy?" You get the idea. Three, Sex and Astrology. If you are an astrology freak like me, you will enjoy this. I learned a lot about Sagittariuses. If you're a Sagittarius, there's something for everyone. For Naughty Network, this one is currently sold out right now, unfortunately, but you could probably find copies like online somewhere, like eBay or something. It's basically like a porn television station, and they're like, "All right, pitch me something," and then it's a bunch of vignettes about different pornos. And then finally, the Storefront Theater series. There are two of these, and these are basically just like, I don't know, like anonymous kind of loops and short films that were kind of found. I guess they're orphan works then technically. Yeah, that we have released, and there's a lot of crazy, crazy stuff in there. So those are mine. And then that's all. Thank you for listening. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. That was really, really informative. And also, I personally did purchase something from the website from you guys, the Showgirls like special edition, because I'm a big Saved by the Bell fan. So I think we have some questions that in the chat. You guys can please keep adding questions for the next few minutes. Amateur question: is there a preferred orientation for storing reels? David Williams answered his own question. Anything else to elaborate on that? Horizontal.
Yeah, I mean, definitely horizontal. We've come across one of the terrible cases that we've come across fairly recently. Unfortunately, sorry, Georgius Museum, we donated it to them, but it was a original negative which had been stored vertically for an enormous amount of time, and I think there was some like excessive moisture in it, and that actually caused the nitric acid to build up on one side. The same can actually happen with triacetate film. It can be a sponge. So please store it horizontally. That's where the perfs are. The perfs lie on the ground. And it's just fully 10 times better for the film, just horizontal all the way. Mhm.
Okay. Amy Heller, you mentioned that you have magnetic tape that you are not cataloging. Are any of these mag tracks for films? The holdings of New York City's Sound One has disappeared, and most of New York indie films lost their mag tracks when it closed.
You want? Yeah, I mean, I talked to Amy briefly about this, but
Oh,
we do have a crazy amount of New York City independent films. Most of the actual mag track, it's like 1/4 inch mag track, and it's not that they were not cataloging all of the full coat. The actual polyester we do take care of and make sure that it's like taken care of in our archive. It's just the 1/4 inch currently where we're making lists, where Lindsay's like the one who's really like been pushing that, where basically we know what we have. There's a lot of M&E tracks, and unfortunately not many low budget independent films from the indie era of New York City. It's mostly adult films. But
Tim Corliss, are you using cloud storage for backup?
We are not using cloud storage for backup. There are some conflicting opinions. I'll just say that when it comes to cloud storage, I, for one, am not anti-cloud storage. However, cloud storage presents a lot of really difficult challenges. To bring back, the sex worker perspective into it, a lot of these cloud storage places, Google especially, they've been known to just delete adult materials from accounts with just no warning at all. It's tough to say whether or not like we would become a target of that or something like that, but it's just kind of important to be wary of those things. But yeah, to answer your question, we don't use cloud storage now.
What temperature is maintained in the cold storage?
currently we're at 64 degrees Fahrenheit. And unfortunately, we had a really terrible instance, which we're still trying to recover from, where the relative humidity went up. And we've been trying to normalize that throughout the entire summer, which has been a nightmare because of the fact that it's been such an incredibly hot summer. But we just added more insulation on the walls, around 1.5 inches currently. So we're trying to like make this space as much like a refrigerator as possible. But again, the biggest issue that we keep coming across is that the owners obviously they want this to be as cold and as efficient as possible, but we're really working with a very porous concrete wall, and it's an uphill battle in order to kind of like control that actual space to the extent that we want to. But 64 degrees, I'd say if you walk in, you're going to be shivering, which is pretty good. And we have a lot of airflow, and we use these vented cans, which I think are like, I don't know, they're really doing wonders for the film so far. And we're trying to go lower. It's a constant progress, I think, forward, where we just keep pushing forward. So, that's what archiving is, just continuously trying to do better, I think.
Yeah, with little money.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Matthew Hawkins has 2 questions. I'll do the first one. If there's been an attempt thus far when it comes to selling live screening rights at revival houses, parentheses, I am uncertain if Vinegar Syndrome is involved with that line of business to begin with, so apologies in advance for any ignorance. And then the second question is about some advice on obtaining a film that is no longer available. So,
Oh man. Let's see. I cannot speak to the first question. And in terms of the second question, it's really got to be eBay. That's your best bet. I would also recommend there's a Facebook group. It's Vinegar Syndrome, like collectors or something. There are always people selling things, and they're always looking for slipcovers. So if you have a slipcover, you could make a couple extra bucks. Yeah, I don't know if you have an answer to those, Oscar.
The first one, I believe AGFA does the vast majority of our theatrical rights, if that's what you're asking. But, you know, for the actual studio titles, you may have to actually go for other, I don't know, rights acquisition companies. But yeah, that's pretty much. The second one, I don't know this. I don't know very much. Obtaining a film is no longer. Yeah, eBay. Unfortunately, I mean, I don't condone eBay. Don't buy anything unless buy it from a friend or borrow it from a friend.
How much time do we have? I think we went over, didn't we? I guess this one, how do you determine what projects you give time and budget? Are priorities set up by donor agreements, or what is that process like?
That's a good question. In terms of the digital assets, I came in and they had exactly what I needed to be doing set up. It was very clear that this backlog needed to be addressed. So I've been working on that ever since I started. And then, you know, additionally, I've been creating workflows for that, actual written workflows, you know, with screenshots of things to do. So that's kind of been a lot of my time for the digital assets. And then in terms of other stuff, it's kind of up to Oscar's discretion. Sometimes he is the one who's kind of dealing with the space, more or less.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you're asking about releases too, that's definitely more of a restoration thing. I think definitely, but in terms of projects that are given time and budget, I definitely focus on as close to the original as first at the beginning, and I don't really think about whether or not we can make a profit on it anytime. I think I see that as another question. As a for-profit company, how's profit model? The profit model is save first, get materials, make sure that we can put resources into saving them, and then we figure out if there's other, I don't know, institutions that would like that material more, just by building relationships with other archives and other companies which are actually interested in taking that type of film. That's why we have a crazy amount of small short films that are reversal original, or a B-roll, or original ECN. So that's kind of how I go first. Or if it's something which I has a cool title, I think both of us are victim to that, where we'll automatically pick something out of the pile if we're like, oh, that needs to go in the archive. You know, we're also
strangest title, the most oddly specific title ever. Those are the ones that I'm always like, I gotta get it. I gotta.
Yeah.
Okay, and Aki Snyder also thinks Oscar's YouTube videos are great. So are there any more coming from you? Do you know?
Thank you, Aki. I thank you so much for your thank you so much. Your what you said earlier when you wrote to me directly meant a lot to me. So really thank you so much for being here and asking that question. I'm trying to work on one right now, but it's very stupid and very short. I have an idea for the next one, and I think it's going to be very fun, and hopefully it's tricky because the way they happen is that I have to pull somebody off of he does camera work and he does restoration, because everybody does 10 little jobs here. So I have to beg him every single time. So shout out to Dave. He's like the best of the best. But I hope the next one is going to be something very fun and very silly. But thank you so much for saying that. It's very nice.
All right, so I think the Oscar music is starting, the Oscar speech music. So thank you guys for doing this. We'll be on the lookout for the next video on the Vinegar Syndrome YouTube. Yeah, this will be posted soon. I think we've said that before and it hasn't, but it will this year. Again, thank you. for doing this. It was great. All right. Good night,
Yes.
everyone. Check the art
Good night.
webpage for our next event. I'm gonna